All right, so this is our first video on our kind of basic chemistry chapter. So if you have had chemistry before and maybe you hated chemistry, you thought it was really difficult, don't be afraid of this chapter, right? So this is just the level of chemistry that you need to know to be successful in anatomy and physiology, right? We're not going to dive into in-depth, chemical structures or anything like that. All right, so we're going to try to keep it pretty simple. That doesn't mean you're not going to have to study some things, right? But we're not going to get too complex with the chemistry. Okay, so very basic chemistry. Okay, so first let's talk about chemistry involves elements, right? Obviously, so we're taking elements, we're going to be bonding them together. So let's talk about what exactly elements are. Okay, so elements are types of atoms. Okay, so we have atoms are essentially the smallest molecule, right? So it's kind of the smallest form anything can be broken down into by natural means. And so we have different types of atoms. We have carbon, we have calcium, we have nitrogen, oxygen, right? Those are all types of atoms called elements. Okay, so before we dive into talking about all the different elements that you should be familiar with for this class, let's just talk about the general structure of an atom first. Okay, so when we look at an atom, we have kind of this central structure that has some positively charged particles and some neutrally charged particles, and they're surrounded by these negatively charged particles that float around them. Okay, so this middle structure right in here is called the nucleus of the atom. Okay, the nucleus of the atom is going to contain protons. All right, protons have a positive charge. All right, so that's going to be the green guys here with our positive charge. And the nucleus is also going to contain neutrons, which have no charge or a neutral charge. Those are going to be these blue guys here. Okay, so that's in the nucleus. We have protons, we have neutrons, and then floating around those in these kind of rings or shells, sometimes they're referred to as clouds, we have electrons, which have a negative charge. Okay, so all of these around there with their little negative charges would be electrons. Okay, and so electrons are really important because, and we're going to spend a lot of time with them, because they are involved in the chemical reactions. All right, so forming and breaking bonds involves electrons. All right, so those are going to be important when we talk about how different bonds are formed, right? What different types of bonds there are, we're always going to be referring to electrons. Okay, so they have a negative charge and they float around the outside of that atom. Okay, and so with our elements, we have a bunch of different chemical symbols for our elements, and so here are the ones that you need to know for this class that you should be familiar with. And so we use chemical symbols to represent them, right? If you've seen a periodic table, the letters on the periodic table, those are the chemical symbols. They just stand for our different elements. All right, so let's go through and label these. So C would stand for carbon. H would stand for hydrogen. O would be oxygen. Talking and writing is not very easy, right? N would be for nitrogen. Ca is for calcium. P is for phosphorus. Na would be for sodium. K would be for potassium. Fe would be for iron. Mg would be magnesium. And S would be sulfur. Okay, so you should know all of those, study those, make flashcards or whatever, even if you just made a little study sheet like this and filled them in just like I did without looking at anything. That's a great way to learn them. That's my recommended way to learn them that we talked about in the last chapter as well with your regional terms. Okay. All right, so those are our chemical symbols that you need to know for this class. All right. So now let's talk about, we're going to start diving into the different types of bonds. Okay. And so before we look at how these ionic bonds are formed, all right, when you have different elements that result from an ionic bond, all right, they have a charge. Okay, so if you've ever seen kind of sodium written, usually it's written in a plus, all right, it has a charge. Calcium is written Cl minus, it has a charge. Those are called ions. So ions are charged elements. We'll see in a second why those elements have a charge, all right? So the element with a positive charge, all right, it's called a cation. So our sodium would be our cation here. And then the element with a negative charge would be an anion. So the chloride would be our anion here. Okay, so now let's talk about bonds, all right? How different bonds are formed between elements. So our first type of bond is going to be an ionic bond, okay? And so remember we said all kind of chemical reactions and bonds result from something going on, interactions between elements relating to their electrons, okay? So with an ionic bond, electrons, which I'm just going to abbreviate like this, E minus, because E for electron, minus because they're negatively charged, all right? Electrons are transferred. Okay, so electrons are being transferred from one element to another. Okay? And so when we have two elements that are going to form an ionic bond, come close to each other, all right, what they're going to do is they're going to form, right, that ionic bond. So here we have sodium and we have chloride. We know that they form a salt called sodium chloride, NaCl, that's table salt. And that's because this sodium wants to give up its electron to this chloride. Okay? So these two are going to come together. And while they're together, that ionic bond is present, right? And it's stable. And this is called a salt. All right? So this is when ionic bond is present. Okay, so that's what we're seeing right here, right? That sodium and that chloride are being held together because this sodium is kind of offering up its electron. The chloride is kind of like, I kind of want to take that electron, but they haven't actually completed the exchange, okay? So they're bonded together, right, by an ionic bond, okay? And so that bond is generally pretty strong, I mean, decently strong, as long as that salt is dry. And you probably know this from experience, right? So as long as the salt is dry, like your table salt, right, it is crystallized, right? That means that ionic bond is there. As soon as you start adding water, though, it starts to dissolve. Your salt will dissolve in water. And that means that the ionic bond is breaking, okay? So then we go, all right, so here we have, actually this would be more of an example. I forgot I added this picture, all right, of where that ionic bond is actually present. So they've kind of got the electron here, right? It's kind of between both the sodium and the chloride. Okay, so that has the ionic bond, all right? And so then when we add water, we dissolve that bond. That's when we end up transferring, all right, the electron from one to the other. So with this scenario, that ionic bond has been broken. And this is where we end up with two ions, okay? So these ions are formed when the ionic bond breaks. All right, so that should make sense why we end up with two charged elements when we break an ionic bond. Okay, so this sodium here, right, I'm going to write this here, has lost an electron. All right, so it's lost a negative charge. So it has fewer negative charges. That would make it more positive, right? If you lose negativity, you become more positive. Okay, so that's why we always write it as a Na plus, sodium plus, because it has a positive charge. It's lost an electron. Our chloride has gained an electron, right? It's become more negative, okay? And that's why we always write chloride with a negative charge, all right? And so remember, this would be our cation because it's positive. This would be our anion because it's negative, okay? So each of these would be an example of an ion because they have a charge, and that results from breaking that ionic bond, okay? So this would be our cation. This would be our anion, okay? All right, so that's ionic bonds. We are actually transferring an electron from one element, our sodium, to another element, our chloride. All right, so this would just be an example. There are many other salts, right? There's potassium chloride, there's magnesium chloride, there are phosphate salts as well that will undergo these same kind of ionic bonds and transferring of electrons. All right, so it's a salt when that bond is intact. As soon as that bond breaks and we end up with our anions, right, our anions and our cations, we no longer have an ionic bond between them. Okay, so that's ionic bonds. All right, so that's transferring electrons. Now we're going to talk about covalent bonds. So covalent bonds are all about sharing electrons. Okay, so think of this as like a tug of war over electrons between two elements. So if those elements are very equally matched, right, we're going to have a nonpolar covalent bond. So in a nonpolar covalent, electrons are shared equally. All right. So that tug of war is a very equal competition. Okay. And so our kind of example molecule I've just drawn here so we can see and kind of visualize it. This is methane. All right. And so this hydrogen would be pulling just as much on the electron as this carbon would, right? And the same with this guy here. Okay, so they're very equally matched, right? One's not stronger than the other, and so they're sharing those electrons equally. Okay, so that is a nonpolar covalent bond. So typically one way to recognize a nonpolar covalent bond is that these things dissolve, or sorry, these things do not dissolve in water. So if I was going to ask you to name something that does not dissolve in water, I'm guessing you would pick some sort of fat or oil, right? And that's absolutely right. So fats and oils are definitely nonpolar. They don't dissolve in water, okay? Another example of a nonpolar molecule is going to be anything that is the same element bonded to itself. So for example, O2, right? Just like the oxygen we breathe, right? If we have two oxygens bonded to each other, they're very obviously equally matched, right? One is not going to be stronger at pulling electrons than the other. And so that is going to be a nonpolar covalent bond, meaning oxygen does not dissolve in water, all right? Which is actually why we need hemoglobin in our blood to carry oxygen, because that oxygen can't just move in our water-based blood. It doesn't dissolve in it. Okay. Also, CO2, carbon dioxide, does not dissolve in water, right? So it is nonpolar. All right, so those are some example of nonpolar covalent molecules. All right, we're going to talk about a lot of these, like these fats, in detail towards the end of this chapter, right, and their chemical structure and that kind of thing. Okay, so nonpolar are sharing electrons equally, and they do not dissolve in water. All right, so then on the other hand, we have polar covalent bonds. All right, for polar covalent, electrons are not shared equally. Okay, and so typically this means that there's going to be some element present that is going to be really strong, right? Like it's the boss of that electron tug of war, right? So it's super, super strong. So we say it's very electronegative, right? So how electronegative is how strong an element pulls electrons. We'll squeeze that in there, okay? So very electronegative elements pull on electrons very strongly. So example would be oxygen is extremely electronegative, and so is nitrogen. Okay, one way to recognize a polar molecule, aside from the fact that water itself is polar, all right, would mean that anything that dissolves in water that's not a salt, right, is going to be polar. All right, so these things are going to dissolve in water. So if we think about like sugar, right, glucose, even like your table sugar dissolves in water. It's definitely non-polar, or it's definitely polar. Many carbohydrates, all carbohydrates are polar. There's a lot of proteins that are polar that we're going to talk about. All right, so those things dissolve in water. Okay. Good. Let's see. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. Yes, so, all right, so with polar molecules, so here is our example of a polar molecule. This would be water, right? Oxygen with 2 hydrogens attached. What happens is, because this oxygen is pulling really strongly on these electrons, which remember have a negative charge, right? It's going to be pulling them closer to its nucleus. That gives this oxygen on this water a little bit of a negative charge, right? So we usually just write that partial negative, right? Just to note that. So it doesn't fully take the electrons, because remember we're sharing, right? Even though the sharing isn't equal, right? We're not transferring. Okay, so this oxygen has a partial negative charge because of those electrons it's kind of pulling towards itself. These hydrogens that are losing kind of a grip on those electrons are going to have a partial positive charge. Okay, and that's very characteristic of polar molecules. So they're going to have partial charges. Okay, so that electronegative element, right, like the oxygen here, is going to have a partial negative charge, and the ones that are losing those electrons to that element are going to have a partial positive charge. Okay, all right, and so one really important thing to think about, especially as we go through this class, is something soluble in water, right? So solubility means, does it dissolve in water or not? Okay, and that is really important because that kind of determines if something can or cannot be transported in the blood. All right, so can it be transported in the blood. Okay, so it has to be able to dissolve in water to be transported in the blood, because the blood is made up mostly of water, right? Blood plasma is primarily water. Okay, so glucose, we know, is polar. It dissolves in water, so definitely yes. All right, salts, they're not polar, but they do dissolve in water. Remember that ionic bond is dissolved by water. It's strong when it's dry, and it dissolves when it's wet. So we know those can. All right, so these are yeses. However, if you think of like fats, definitely not, right? Fats are a no. Okay, and actually you'll see in ANP2 that fats, when you eat fats and they're absorbed through your digestive system, they have to be wrapped in proteins, right? Which is, protein is polar, typically. All right. To move in the blood. Okay, so there's going to be strategies for things we still need to transport in the blood to actually move them when they are non-polar. Okay, so these fats are going to be wrapped in proteins, right? Those are called lipoproteins, right? So protein that is wrapped around a fat. Lipo is just kind of the prefix for fat. It refers to fats, right? So lipoproteins. Okay, so it's really important to understand what does and does not dissolve in water to know what can be transported in the blood, what needs kind of an alternate method of transport. So another good example, we said oxygen, right, does not dissolve in water. So it cannot just move in the blood however it wants to, right? That's why it has to be attached to hemoglobin. Okay? So it's really important to understand, that's kind of why we're talking about these chemical bonds, polar versus non-polar and that kind of thing. All right, so our last type of bond we're going to talk about is called a hydrogen bond. So hydrogen bonds form between that partial, whoops, that was not very pretty, there we go. The partial charge of polar molecules. Okay, so if we have these two water molecules here, all right, this oxygen on this one's going to be a little negative, this hydrogen on this one's going to be a little positive here, a little positive on this hydrogen here, this oxygen will be a little negative, and this hydrogen will be a little positive. Okay, and so remember, opposites attract. Positive charges are attracted to negative charges. And so what would happen is we would end up getting this, based on that attraction, this bond, right, very loose bond forming between this partial negative of the oxygen and the partial positive of the hydrogen here. That is called a hydrogen bond. Okay? Hydrogen bonds are very weak bonds. All right? They're weak individually. They can be strong when you have a lot of them together, all right? But they are the weakest type of individual bond. Okay, and so a lot of the really important properties of water, right? The reason water and sweat can help you cool down, that kind of thing, are due to these hydrogen bonds between these polar molecules. Okay, so that is hydrogen bonding. All right, so let's just talk about these few terms here really quick, and that'll be the end of this video. And then we'll pick up on our next video talking about inorganic compounds. Okay, so we're going to move on to specific types of molecules. All right, so a couple terms before we do that. Metabolism is, I'm sure, a term you've heard before. And so if I were to ask you to define metabolism, I would guess you would say something along the lines of, your body using calories, things you eat for energy, right? How quickly your body uses calories for energy or something like that, which is understandable, right? That's generally how we think of metabolism. However, this actual definition for metabolism is all of the chemical reactions in a cell. Okay, so down the line, this would affect how that body collectively, made up of all of these cells, is going to use energy. But if we're actually defining metabolism, it is defined as all of the chemical reactions in a cell. Okay, so that cell is forming bonds, breaking bonds, it's using energy, all that good stuff, right? It's making ATP for energy. It's using that ATP to do different processes depending on the type of cell. That would all add up to metabolism. All right, and so metabolism would greatly affect the energy usage of your body, and so that's where that connection comes from. All right, but the definition of metabolism is all of the chemical reactions in a cell. Okay? All right, and so with chemical reactions, we can have chemical reactions that are either anabolic or catabolic. Okay, so anabolism is going to be a reaction that forms a bond, versus catabolism would be a reaction that breaks a bond. Okay, so if we just do a very simple example, all right, so if we have two kind of glucose, let's just say 3 glucose molecules kind of floating around here, all right, and we put them together, we form bonds between them, all right, we end up with glucose bonded to another glucose, bonded to another glucose. That is anabolism, right? We just formed bonds between those 3 molecules. Okay, and so then we can kind of reverse that, take our little 3 glucose molecule here and break those bonds and kind of free those glucoses to now float around again. That is catabolism. And I always remember cats often get amusement out of breaking things and destroying things, knocking things off of high shelves, that kind of stuff. And so that kind of makes me think of, catabolism. They're kind of, a little destructive, right? They get some kind of sick joy out of knocking things over. And so that's how I actually remember catabolism. Okay. And so then another term relating to these chemical reactions is that they can be either exergonic or endergonic. Okay, so exergonic it means that they release energy. Okay, and endergonic would be a reaction that would require energy. Whoops. Okay, and so typically breaking bonds is going to be releasing energy. All right, so this is typically done through breaking a bond. And reactions that require energy a lot of times are going to be reactions that form a bond. Okay, and we'll kind of see a lot of this in action as we go through this chapter. We'll kind of see some of these forming and breaking bonds and stuff like that. All right, so that's where we're going to end this video. And then we'll pick up the second one and talk about some organic or inorganic molecules. And then we'll start talking about our kind of big category of organic molecules.